April 1945. The Third Reich was in its death throes. The Allied forces were advancing rapidly across the German heartland, pushing eastward with an unstoppable momentum. For the battle-hardened soldiers of General George S. Patton's Third Army, the end of the war finally felt within reach. They had survived the freezing hell of the Ardennes. They had breached the heavily fortified Siegfried Line. They thought they had seen the absolute worst that human beings could do to one another on a battlefield. They were wrong. The true nightmare of the Second World War was not waiting for them in the trenches or the bombed-out cities. It was waiting behind barbed wire. On the morning of April 12th, Patton, alongside General Dwight D. Eisenhower and General Omar Bradley, stepped through the iron gates of Ohrdruf. It was a subcamp of the massive Buchenwald concentration camp network, and the first of its kind to be liberated by American forces. Before they even saw the horror, they smelled it. It was a thick, suffocating stench of decay and burning flesh that hung in the spring air for miles around. When the generals walked into the compound, the reality of the Nazi regime shattered whatever military stoicism they had left. There were no enemy soldiers to fight here, only the dead and the barely living. Bodies were stacked like cordwood in the courtyard, emaciated frames covered in lime, discarded like refuse. Starved survivors, looking more like walking skeletons than men, approached the American generals in hollow silence. Patton, the legendary blood and guts commander, who had ridden through the bloodiest battlefields of North Africa and Europe without flinching, physically recoiled. He walked over to the side of a barracks, leaned against the rough wooden wall, and violently threw up. The sheer concentrated evil of the place was too much even for him. But as the initial shock began to subside, a new, colder emotion took its place. A slow, burning, uncontrollable rage. Patton looked at the camp, and then he looked toward the horizon. Less than 2 miles away lay the pristine, picturesque German town of Gotha. The wind blew directly from the camp toward the town. The stench was undeniable. The ashes from the crematorium had rained down on their rooftops for years. Yet, when American intelligence officers questioned the local civilians and the town's mayor earlier that morning, the response was a synchronized, rehearsed chorus of absolute ignorance. "We didn't know," the civilians said. "We thought it was just a labor camp. We had no idea what was happening behind the walls." Patton stood in the middle of the corpses, his jaw set, his eyes dark. He knew they were lying. The ash was on their streets. The smell was in their homes. The blood was on their hands. They had lived their quiet, comfortable lives while thousands were systematically murdered in their backyard. The general turned to his officers, the sickness in his stomach now replaced by an ironclad resolve for justice. If the civilians of Germany wanted to pretend they were blind to the atrocities of the regime they had supported, Patton was going to force them to open their eyes. The era of denial was over. Patton didn't call for a tribunal. He didn't ask for a diplomatic inquiry. He turned to his military police commanders and issued an order that would echo through history. "Get them," he said. His voice was no longer trembling from the sickness of the camp. It was cold, hard, and absolute. "Go down to Gotha. Get the mayor. Get the city council. Get the butchers, the bakers, the well-dressed wives. I want them all up here. I want them to see what they allowed to happen." The American jeeps and transport trucks roared down the hill, kicking up thick clouds of dust on the road to the nearby town. When the military police entered Gotha, they found a surreal, almost insulting scene. The streets were clean, the windows were intact. The civilians were going about their daily routines, sweeping their porches, chatting on corners, as if the most destructive war in human history was merely an inconvenience happening somewhere else. When the heavily armed American soldiers began knocking on doors, dragging people out of their comfortable living rooms and businesses, there was immediate outrage. The German civilians protested loudly. They demanded to know why they were being treated this way. They claimed innocence. They claimed ignorance. They repeated the same hollow, rehearsed mantra to every soldier who grabbed their arm. "We knew nothing. We had nothing to do with it." The American soldiers didn't argue. They didn't shout back. They simply pointed their M1 Garand rifles up the hill toward Ohrdruf. It was a forced march of a very different kind. The civilians, dressed in their Sunday best, tailored suits, pressed dresses, polished leather shoes, were ordered to walk the 2 miles up the dirt road. It was the exact same 2 miles that the stench of death had traveled every single day for years. As they marched under the watchful, unforgiving eyes of the Third Army, the complaints slowly died down. The closer they got to the iron gates, the heavier the air became. The smell, which they had previously dismissed to their neighbors as a local factory or burning trash, now became suffocating and undeniable. It clung to their expensive clothes. It coated their throats. The reality of what they had ignored was physically forcing its way into their lungs. Patton waited at the entrance. He stood like a statue, watching them walk up the path. He saw the exact moment the truth began to shatter their comfortable illusions. The arrogance faded from the mayor's face, replaced by a pale, sickly dread. The women pulled out silk handkerchiefs, pressing them tightly against their mouths and noses, trying to block out the odor of the slaughterhouse. But Patton wasn't going to let them hide behind silk. He wasn't going to let them look away. He instructed his guards to move in. "Take away the handkerchiefs," Patton ordered. "Make them smell it. Make them breathe it." The gates swung wide open. The civilians were pushed forward into the blood-soaked courtyard. The silence of the murdered dead was about to meet the silence of the guilty living. Patton didn't call for a tribunal. He didn't ask for a diplomatic inquiry. He turned to his military police commanders and issued an order that would echo through history. "Get them," he said. His voice was no longer trembling from the sickness of the camp. It was cold, hard, and absolute. "Go down to Gotha. Get the mayor. Get the city council. Get the butchers, the bakers, the well-dressed wives. I want them all up here. I want them to see what they allowed to happen." The American jeeps and transport trucks roared down the hill, kicking up thick clouds of dust on the road to the nearby town. When the military police entered Gotha, they found a surreal, almost insulting scene. The streets were clean, the windows were intact. The civilians were going about their daily routines, sweeping their porches, chatting on corners, as if the most destructive war in human history was merely an inconvenience happening somewhere else. When the heavily armed American soldiers began knocking on doors, dragging people out of their comfortable living rooms and businesses, there was immediate outrage. The German civilians protested loudly. They demanded to know why they were being treated this way. They claimed innocence. They claimed ignorance. They repeated the same hollow, rehearsed mantra to every soldier who grabbed their arm. "We knew nothing. We had nothing to do with it." The American soldiers didn't argue. They didn't shout back. They simply pointed their M1 Garand rifles up the hill toward Ohrdruf. It was a forced march of a very different kind. The civilians, dressed in their Sunday best, tailored suits, pressed dresses, polished leather shoes, were ordered to walk the 2 miles up the dirt road. It was the exact same 2 miles that the stench of death had traveled every single day for years. As they marched under the watchful, unforgiving eyes of the Third Army, the complaints slowly died down. The closer they got to the iron gates, the heavier the air became. The smell, which they had previously dismissed to their neighbors as a local factory or burning trash, now became suffocating and undeniable. It clung to their expensive clothes. It coated their throats. The reality of what they had ignored was physically forcing its way into their lungs. Patton waited at the entrance. He stood like a statue, watching them walk up the path. He saw the exact moment the truth began to shatter their comfortable illusions. The arrogance faded from the mayor's face, replaced by a pale, sickly dread. The women pulled out silk handkerchiefs, pressing them tightly against their mouths and noses, trying to block out the odor of the slaughterhouse. But Patton wasn't going to let them hide behind silk. He wasn't going to let them look away. He instructed his guards to move in. "Take away the handkerchiefs," Patton ordered. "Make them smell it. Make them breathe it." The gates swung wide open. The civilians were pushed forward into the blood-soaked courtyard. The silence of the murdered dead was about to meet the silence of the guilty living. The first thing that hit the civilians of Gotha wasn't the sight, but the sound. It was the sound of absolute, crushing silence. A camp that had once held thousands of prisoners, echoing with the shouts of guards and the groans of forced labor, was now a tomb. As the townspeople were herded past the heavy iron gates by the military police, the reality of the labor camp they had lived next to was laid bare in all its gruesome detail. There were no factories, there were no workshops, there were only rows of wooden barracks and the dead. Patton had ordered that nothing be cleaned up. Nothing was to be sanitized or covered for the delicate sensibilities of the townspeople. They were led first to a shed that the SS had used as a makeshift morgue. Inside, bodies were stacked in brutal, unceremonious piles, tangled together in a final indignity. The skin of the victims was pulled tight over their bones, their eyes sunken, their mouths open in silent screams. The reaction was immediate. A woman near the front of the group screamed, a sharp, piercing sound that cut through the heavy air. Several others collapsed to their knees, weeping uncontrollably. A well-dressed man who had argued vehemently just an hour earlier that he was a respectable businessman with no ties to the Nazi party leaned over and vomited onto the dirt. The military police didn't offer comfort. They didn't look away. They stood with their rifles slung over their shoulders, watching the facade of innocent ignorance crumble before their eyes. Patton watched from a distance. His expression remained hard, unreadable. He had seen men die in combat. He had seen the brutal, chaotic destruction of artillery and tank fire. But this was different. This was industrial. This was deliberate. This was the systematic erasure of human beings, carried out by a regime that these very people had cheered for in the streets of their pristine town. The tour didn't stop at the morgue. The military police guided the group further into the compound, toward the pyres. The SS, in their panicked retreat as the American forces approached, had tried to burn the evidence of their crimes. They had run out of time. Half-burnt corpses lay interwoven with blackened logs on railway tracks that had been repurposed as massive grills. The civilians were forced to walk up close. They were forced to see the charred remains, the unburned limbs, the sheer scale of the slaughter. One of the American officers, a young lieutenant who looked as if he hadn't slept in days, stepped forward. He spoke fluent German. He didn't yell. His voice was terrifyingly calm. "Look," he said, pointing to the pyres. "Look at what your leaders did. Look at what you allowed to happen." The civilians tried to turn their heads. They tried to close their eyes, but the MPs were there, ensuring that every single person from Gotha took in the full measure of the atrocity. The air of denial that had protected them for years was gone. They could no longer claim they didn't know. The truth was burned into their retinas. The smell of the dead was in their clothes. The blood was finally recognized. And Patton wasn't finished. The physical tour of the camp was only the first part of the lesson. The real punishment, the true reckoning, was yet to come. The visual shock of the pyres was devastating, but Patton's sense of justice demanded more than just tears and nausea. He demanded physical consequence. As the civilians from Gotha stood trembling in the courtyard, their pristine clothes now stained with the soot and smell of the camp, the general issued his next command. It was an order that struck deeper than any bullet or artillery shell. They were not allowed to simply leave, wash their hands, and return to their comfortable denial. Patton decreed that the townspeople of Gotha would be the ones to bury the dead. The military police moved through the crowd, handing out shovels, spades, and where there were no tools left, they pointed to the hardened earth. The message was clear. They would dig with their bare hands if necessary. Men who had spent the war sitting in comfortable offices, women who had turned a blind eye while sipping coffee in their parlors, were marched toward the mass graves. They were ordered to lift the emaciated, decomposing bodies of the victims, people they had considered subhuman, people they had deliberately ignored, and carry them to the freshly dug trenches. There were no masks provided. There were no gloves. The physical contact was absolute. The German civilians, weeping and retching, had to feel the dead weight of the corpses in their arms. They had to feel the brittle, protruding bones, the cold, leathery skin against their own. For every single body they lowered into the earth, the horrifying reality of the regime they had supported was permanently etched into their souls. Among the crowd was the mayor of Gotha, the very man who had stood before American officers that morning and sworn, on his honor, that his town knew absolutely nothing. Patton made sure the mayor saw everything. He made sure the man stood at the edge of the pit and watched his citizens carrying the victims of his government. The psychological weight of that moment was a crushing, inescapable force. The mayor didn't speak. He didn't protest anymore. He simply stared into the abyss of the mass grave, his face drained of all color, his posture completely broken. When the grim, agonizing work was finally paused for the evening, the civilians were allowed to return to their homes. But the camp followed them. They carried the dirt under their fingernails and the stench of death in their hair. That night, the mayor and his wife returned to their quiet home in Gotha. Everything appeared unchanged. The clean walls, the carefully arranged furniture, the familiar surroundings. Yet the illusion had been shattered. Confronted with the reality of what their complicity had contributed to, they left behind a short note. The next day, they were found dead in their home. When Patton received the report of the suicides the next morning, he didn't express pity. He didn't blink. He simply nodded. The reckoning had begun, but there was still more work to be done. What happened at Ohrdruf did not remain an isolated incident. Patton's brutal, uncompromising approach to civilian denial sent a shockwave through the Allied High Command. The news of the forced march, the compulsory burials, and the subsequent suicide of the mayor spread rapidly among the advancing American and British forces. General Eisenhower, who had stood beside Patton on that horrifying morning, was profoundly moved by the general's actions. Eisenhower realized that this was not merely about punishment, it was about historical documentation. Eisenhower immediately recognized the danger that, decades later, people might claim these atrocities were exaggerated or entirely fabricated. He famously sent a message back to Washington and London, urging them to send journalists, photographers, and members of Congress to the camps immediately. "We are told that the American soldier does not know what he is fighting for," Eisenhower wrote. "Now, at least, he will know what he is fighting against." Patton's mandate at Gotha became an unwritten doctrine for the Third Army and beyond. As Allied forces continued to push into Germany, uncovering camp after camp, Buchenwald, Dachau, Mauthausen, the response followed a familiar, grim pattern. Whenever they encountered a town situated suspiciously close to a site of mass murder, the military police no longer asked for cooperation. They demanded attendance. In Weimar, near the main Buchenwald camp, 1,000 civilians were marched under armed guard to view the crematoria, the execution rooms, and the emaciated survivors. In Dachau, near Munich, local residents were forced to walk past train cars packed with bodies. The American commanders adopted Patton's cold logic. The citizens who had reaped the economic benefits of the regime, who had looked the other way while their neighbors disappeared, would be the ones to witness the ultimate cost of their silence. The psychological impact of these forced tours was profound. For years, the Nazi propaganda machine had carefully shielded the general populace from the visceral reality of the final solution. They knew of the camps, they knew of the deportations, but the blood and the stench had been kept at a comfortable distance. Patton shattered that distance. He forced the civilians to cross the threshold from abstract knowledge to physical confrontation. This was not a process of reconciliation. It was a process of forced reckoning. Patton didn't care if the civilians of Gotha or Weimar ever found peace. He cared that they never forgot. He ensured that the memory of the victims was branded into the minds of the very people who had allowed them to perish. The era of claiming "we didn't know" died in the mud and ash of Ohrdruf. The forced burials were only the beginning of Patton's relentless campaign against forgetting. He understood, with a chilling, almost prophetic clarity, the fragile nature of human memory and the insidious power of historical revisionism. If the civilians of Gotha could lie directly to his face while the ashes of Ohrdruf were still settling on their own rooftops, what would the world say in 10, 20, or 50 years? Patton decided that forcing them to touch the blood and dirt was not enough. He needed ink, celluloid, and film. He needed undeniable proof that could never be buried. Within hours of the camp's liberation, urgent orders cracked over the radio lines, demanding the immediate deployment of the U.S. Army Signal Corps. Jeeps carrying combat photographers and newsreel cameramen began pouring into the camps across the American sector. These were hardened men who had filmed the bloody, chaotic landings at Normandy and the brutal, close-quarters street fighting in Aachen. They were intimately accustomed to death. But when they framed the mass graves of Ohrdruf in their viewfinders, many of these veteran cameramen openly wept behind their lenses. Patton's instructions to the press corps were brutally specific. He didn't just want wide, impersonal shots of the camps. He wanted close-ups. He wanted the skeletal, hollow faces of the victims. He wanted the crude instruments of torture. Most importantly, he explicitly ordered the photographers to capture the faces of the German civilians as they were forced to walk through the carnage. The cameras recorded the mayor of Gotha's pale, trembling face before his suicide. They recorded the well-dressed women swooning into the mud. They captured the exact, undeniable moment when willful ignorance collided with physical reality. The general also issued an unprecedented directive to his own fighting men. For years, the military censors had carefully monitored letters home to maintain stateside morale and protect operational security. Patton told his commanders to drop the filters and let the truth flow. "Tell them to write exactly what they see," he ordered. Tens of thousands of young American boys, farm kids from Iowa, factory workers from Detroit, clerks from Brooklyn, sat down in the mud of a conquered Germany by the flickering light of kerosene lanterns. They wrote agonizing, meticulously detailed letters to their mothers, their wives, and their local hometown newspapers. In doing so, they became reluctant, essential historians, documenting a scale of industrial murder that completely defied human comprehension. Patton was turning his entire Third Army into an army of permanent witnesses. He knew that the war would end, that politicians would eventually sign treaties and shake hands, and that the world would desperately want to move on. But by forcing the cameras to roll and the pens to write, Patton was ensuring that the shadow of Ohrdruf would permanently stain the pristine myth of civilian innocence. The evidence was being cemented in black and white, forever immune to the decay of time. Patton's actions at Ohrdruf were severe, unyielding, and completely devoid of traditional diplomatic courtesy. By the standards of peacetime, marching civilians at gunpoint to handle decaying corpses might have been viewed as a profound overreach. But April 1945 was not peacetime, and Ohrdruf was not a normal battlefield. It was a factory of death, and Patton understood that a new kind of evil required a new kind of justice. He didn't seek permission from Washington to execute his plan. He didn't wait for a war crimes tribunal to convene in Nuremberg months or years down the line. Patton believed that justice delayed in the face of such absolute horror was no justice at all. The punishment had to be immediate. It had to be visceral. It had to be linked directly to the crime of silence that the civilians had committed every single day they looked the other way. When Eisenhower later addressed the troops and the world regarding the camps, the tone was set by what had happened on that hill outside Gotha. The American military was no longer just fighting an enemy army. They were dismantling an ideology built on systematic dehumanization. The forced tours and burials became the first step in the denazification process, a brutal but necessary psychological shock designed to break the German populace out of their complicity. Decades later, the photographs and newsreels ordered by Patton remain some of the most potent, undeniable evidence of the Holocaust. When Holocaust deniers attempt to rewrite history, the images of the well-dressed citizens of Gotha standing over the mass graves of Ohrdruf stand as a silent, unshakable rebuttal. Patton, a man often criticized for his lack of tact and his explosive temper, had ironically secured the most crucial historical documentation of the 20th century. He didn't just liberate a camp, he forced the world to bear witness. He stripped away the luxury of ignorance. For the dead of Ohrdruf, who had been stripped of their names, their families, and their dignity, Patton offered the only form of closure available in the dying days of the war. He forced their murderers and those who stood by the murderers to look them in the face. The mayor of Gotha may have chosen to escape that reality, but because of Patton, the rest of the world could never look away again. The stench of the camps eventually faded from the wind, but the ink and celluloid remained, ensuring that the dead would not be forgotten and the guilty could never truly wash their hands. As the reports of the death camps began to saturate the American public's awareness, a dangerous revisionist current started to form beneath the surface. It was a subtle, creeping denial, a post-war phenomenon, where some voices, both in Germany and among Allied sympathizers, began to rationalize the inexplicable. They called the photographs staged. They whispered that the evidence was Allied propaganda, designed to justify the harshness of the occupation. Patton, hearing these murmurs from his headquarters, knew that the fight was not just about the past. It was about the integrity of history itself. He didn't just worry about the German people, he worried about the American soul. He knew that if his soldiers and the citizens back in the United States began to view the atrocities as mere political theater, the moral foundation of their victory would evaporate. The general became a relentless, one-man intelligence agency dedicated to the preservation of the truth. He ordered his command staff to treat every piece of evidence, every register, every ledger, every personal item found in the barracks, not as battlefield trash, but as sacred relics of a crime scene. Patton's obsession with documentation sometimes put him at odds with the diplomatic bureaucrats in Eisenhower's Supreme Command. They wanted to smooth over the rough edges of the occupation to foster a stable post-war peace. Patton didn't care about stability. He cared about the weight of the bodies they had buried. He famously remarked to a visiting American congressman that if anyone in Washington doubted the necessity of the war, they should have been standing where he was at Ohrdruf. He wasn't interested in the politics of appeasement. He was interested in the raw, unvarnished history that he had witnessed with his own eyes. The general spent his final weeks in command in Germany personally vetting the logistics of the camp tours. He demanded that not a single detail be skipped. He wanted the civilians to see the specialized equipment for extracting gold fillings. He wanted them to see the piles of shoes, thousands of them, children's shoes mixed with adult boots, that had been meticulously sorted for shipment back to the Reich. He was building a wall of evidence that would be too high for any future denier to climb over. It was a cold, calculated strategy of moral saturation. By flooding the public consciousness with the grim reality of the camps, Patton was creating a societal immune system. He knew that by forcing the population to look at the worst of what they had been capable of, or had been willing to ignore, he was compelling them to confront a reality that could never be unseen. He was an iron-fisted guardian of memory, ensuring that even as the ruins were cleared and the cities were rebuilt, the truth of Ohrdruf would remain an unmovable monument to the human capacity for evil and the necessary, brutal requirement of justice. The soldiers who had been the first to walk into the slaughterhouses of the Nazi regime did not come home to parades, at least not at first. They came home with something far heavier. The documentation efforts that Patton had championed, the photos, the journals, the meticulously recorded testimony, slowly made their way back to the United States, but the men who had been at Ohrdruf, Buchenwald, and Dachau were often silent. They carried the memory of the ash, the smell of the lime, and the hollow eyes of the survivors as a secret, permanent companion. Patton understood that the war wouldn't truly be won just by signing a surrender document on a desk in a formal room. The true victory required the moral dismantling of the Nazi machine, and that was the process he had jump-started by dragging the civilians of Gotha into the camp. He saw the shift in his own men. They had arrived in Germany with a set of rules, a code of conduct for fighting a civilized opponent. They left with the realization that they had been engaged in a crusade against a fundamental corruption of humanity. As the trials at Nuremberg began, the evidence that Patton's men had so ruthlessly documented, the photos of the unburied dead, the detailed logs of the camp administration, the physical evidence of starvation, became the bedrock of the prosecution's case. Without the immediate action Patton had taken to freeze the scene, to force the witness of the civilians, and to empower the press, the defense attorneys at Nuremberg might have successfully spun a narrative of just following orders or ignorance of the atrocities, but the images were inescapable. The footage taken by the Signal Corps on Patton's direct orders was played in the courtroom, forcing the architects of the Holocaust to watch their own handiwork. There was no more denying. There was no more hiding. The GIs, who had been ordered to write home about what they saw, had effectively helped build the gallows for the regime's leaders. Patton's uncompromising nature, his blood and guts philosophy, had found its ultimate expression not in the tactical maneuvers on the battlefield, but in this stubborn refusal to let the truth be buried. He had forced a nation to confront its shadow, and in doing so, he had ensured that the moral failure of the Third Reich would be documented for all of history to see. The letters they had written home, under Patton's directive, served as a bridge between the front line and the civilian population, who had been shielded from the reality of the war. These letters were often messy, tear-stained, and deeply ungrammatical, but they possessed a terrifying raw authority. They didn't speak in political terms or strategic overviews. They spoke of the boy they found in a shed, of the mother holding a dead child, of the way the ground seemed to vibrate with the presence of the forgotten. Patton's no-filter policy on correspondence had been a strategic move, a way to ensure that the American public could never claim they didn't know the nature of the enemy they had been asked to defeat. The general had known that an informed electorate would never back down from the necessary task of eradicating fascism, and he was determined to keep them informed even at the cost of their innocence. The silence of the returning veterans would, in time, evolve into a somber, shared weight, a historical testimony that served as the final, enduring victory over the silence of the camps. The silence that descended upon Ohrdruf after the camp was cleared did not signal an end, but a beginning. Patton's command to document everything, the mass graves, the torture chambers, the discarded belongings, had transformed these sites of horror into permanent, immovable witnesses. The general knew that memories fade, that stories get twisted, and that regimes, even the most monstrous ones, eventually seek to sanitize their own histories. By forcing the hand of history, Patton had ensured that the truth would be carved into the collective conscience of the world. For the soldiers of the Third Army, the experience was a transformative crucible. They had left their homes to fight a conventional war against a uniformed enemy, expecting a struggle defined by tactics, geography, and military might. They did not expect to become the primary witnesses to the annihilation of a people. Yet, in the months that followed, this became their most solemn duty. They were no longer just conquerors. They were custodians of the truth. They guarded the integrity of the crime scenes, protected the evidence, and bore witness for those who no longer had voices to speak for themselves. The emotional payoff for the families of the victims and for humanity itself was a devastating kind of closure. It was the knowledge that the evil committed there had not been allowed to vanish into the shadows. The images of Ohrdruf became the moral compass for the post-war order. When the world looked at the Nuremberg Trials, when they saw the evidence presented against the architects of the Nazi genocide, the foundation had been laid by the men who had walked the path of the forced tour. Patton's final judgment on the civilians of Gotha was harsh, but it was born from a desperate, searing need to prevent such a betrayal of humanity from ever happening again. He had treated the dead with the respect they were denied in life, by forcing their killers and the silent observers to face them in death. The moral weight of those days remained with Patton until the end of his own life. He had seen the ultimate limit of human cruelty, and he had looked it directly in the eye, refusing to flinch, refusing to forgive, and refusing to let it be forgotten. Today, when we speak of the liberation of Europe, we speak of the tanks, the strategy, and the grand maneuvers. But the truest, most enduring victory of the Second World War was the reclamation of truth. The Third Army didn't just win a war. They preserved the dignity of the dead, ensuring that their names, even if only remembered as the victims of Ohrdruf, would stand as a permanent indictment against hatred. Patton's legacy in those final days was not the armor he commanded, but the mirror he held up to a nation that had tried to pretend it hadn't seen the fire. The war ended, the borders were redrawn, but the truth remained, burned deep into the earth, just as Patton had intended.